Good afternoon. My name is Abbas Milani, Director of Iranian Studies Program, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Balslev. Before I say a few words about her work, there's something rather incredibly synchronicitous about our last week's program, this week's program, and our next week's program. Last week, we had a program, a brilliant translation of Forough Farrokhzad into English. Today, we have a brilliant scholar who has discussed masculinity and femininity, and she's also a translator of Forough Farrokhzad into Hebrew. These are her two translations of Forough Farrokhzad into Hebrew. And next week, we have Farzaneh Milani, who is one of the preeminent scholars of Forough Farrokhzad, talking about this. So it is not accidental that this year is the year of woman, life, liberty. It's not by accident that women have such a prominent role in Iran. It's a long history, and it is because of people like Professor Balslev, Dominic, and Farzaneh Milani that we know so much about Iran and about the emerging women's movement. It is, let me say this, if you need to get up to go buy the book, go ahead and do it. This is a remarkable book. It is a work of truly exhaustive scholarship. The amount of work that has gone into writing this book, into tapping into different aspects of Iranian culture, Iranian politics, Iranian education, Iranian sports, childhood rearing, man and woman's relationship, concepts of sexuality. She has tapped into all of these things with a kind of a passion, with a kind of detailed orientation that is simply awe-inspiring. So it provides a remarkable window into a very important moment in Iranian transition from Oriental despotism to a modern regime called the Pahlavi era. Her view of her work was brought to me yesterday in a way that I couldn't have articulated it any better way. She kindly agreed to come to my class yesterday. I have a class on politics in Iran. And when talking about her work in Jerusalem, she teaches at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She says, I see one of my primary responsibilities in class is to tell the students that beneath and beyond the rhetoric of politics, beyond what you hear about Iran in the media, Israeli media, global media, there is Iranian society, there is an Iranian people, there is Iranian culture that is very different than what you see in terms of the regime and its politics. You cannot be a more, I think, democratic, egalitarian, humanitarian, and humane scholar in these truly benighted times. These are very dark times, and to have people like her, I think, for me, is a ray of hope that we can get beyond these dark moments. Thank you. Welcome.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Milani, for introducing me in such a very moving way. So what I would like to do today is really to kind of give an overview of my book, to take you with me on like this journey of how Iranian masculinities changed between the late 19th century to the mid-20th century, more or less. And the book really, what I've been trying to do in this book is to present this transformation of what it meant to be a real man, or what it meant to be a manly man in Iran between the late 19th century and the mid-20th century. And it's it's structured both chronologically and thematically, and this way I try and trace the different notions that became prominent and incorporated into a new hegemonic masculinity throughout these decades. And just a short explanation of hegemonic masculinity, it's a concept coined by sociologist Raewyn Connell that the idea that in every society, in every culture, in every time, there is a notion of ideal masculinity, of the manly man, and that this notion is changing, and it's historically it's an historical and cultural construct changing, and it's really linked to power relations. And the role of hegemonic masculinity, according to Connell, is first and foremost to preserve patriarchy, to justify patriarchy, the control of men over women, but also to justify and preserve the control of certain groups of men over other groups of men, because not all men are, of course, equally sharing this, this power in society. So what I've been trying to achieve in the book is also to look, by using hegemonic masculinity, to try and look at changing power relations within Iranian society and with the rise of a new social group that I term the Western-educated elite. So the chapters, for all the order of the chapters beyond the chronological and thematic order, it also has this sequence from more universal notions about manhood and about men and about humanity through the association with the national community, the national Iranian community, to the individual man, and from abstract manhood to the concrete Iranian male body. My first chapter, like an introductory chapter, it provides the backdrop for the construction of a new model of masculinity, and it presents the notions and ideals of manhood that were prevalent prior to the emergence of this new hegemonic masculinity. And central to the chapter is the notion of Javanmardi, of chivalry, of the charitable and hospitable and man, the honest man. So the Javanmard was both a pillar of his community, the immediate community. He could have been like the local magnate, the wealthy and respectable Bazari, but he could also be the luti. They were also treated as emblems of Javanmardi, the neighborhood bully or strongman who defended the weak and exercised in the Zurkhane. So when I was looking at this duality of Javanmardi and trying to figure out how does it work with hegemonic masculinity that is usually looked at in terms of, either class power relations or sometimes race power relations. And, we have here like these very two different social groups, and they're both considered as Javanmard. So what does it say to us? And what I was thinking is that in this society, in Qajar society, there was really no need to justify patriarchy, because patriarchy was not really challenged during these times. And also, social mobility was not very much in existence. So what I see here is that Javanmardi is it's less about the need to create or preserve power dynamics, and more about how to justify them, to give them legitimacy. Because Javanmardi legitimizes the financial or the wealth of the wealthy because they are charitable and because they earned their money in an honest way. And sometimes, they give to the poor. And it also justifies the physical power of the lutee because he uses his power to defend the weak. So it's more about legitimacy than about getting the power relations in place. Because hegemony is not just about power, it's also about power that it is conceived as legitimate but by those who don't have the power, by the ruled. So this is how I thought about Javanmardi as hegemonic masculinity in the mid-19th century. And what I saw is also that Javanmardi was gradually marginalized by a new social, group, by the Western educated elite masculinity. So Javanmardi, on the one hand, is being pushed to the side, and on the other hand, it's being incorporated into new ideas of masculinity, but in a very thin way, like taking away a lot of the connotations it had before and leaving it only with something like the equivalence of generosity, for example. And we can see as a way of demonstrating this, the changing position or this changing status of the Zurkhane from a place that was considered a place of Javanmardi ethos to a place that is considered as a place full of vice and depravity, from a place that has the connotation of male virtue to a place of dubious morals. And from there, I move on in the book's second chapter to deal with education. Because during the late 19th century, mostly the last quarter of the 19th century, we see the reformist discourse in Iran that is really centered around the importance of science, the importance of knowledge and of education. And the way it is done is by tying modern knowledge and tying education to notions of honor and of humanity, meaning you can't be really fully human without having modern knowledge. So I opened the chapter by really centering on this growing weight that is attached to science in the discourse of Iranian reformists, and you see it really in newspapers such as Qanun, such as Akhtar, that are centering around the importance of modern science and modern knowledge as a prerequisite of humanity. But it has a gendered tone to it. It has a gendered tone to it, first and foremost, because it was usually boys who received education and not so much girls, and also because of the use of many terms of honor that is often linked to the idea of masculinity. So this new knowledge was, in practice, really reserved for elite men. And so women and men outside the elite were excluded from this new ideal and new practices of masculinity, which made them, of course, less masculine and sometimes even less, perhaps even less human, and creating a new hierarchy between the educated and the uneducated. And also, the new schools and the new education created or transformed Iranian practices and perceptions of the male body and of time among their students. It could have been through new forms of discipline, which included school uniform, classroom organization, clockwork time. And when you read through memoirs of people who experienced both the traditional system of education, the maktab, and the modern system of education, you see the experience, the different experience of being in a modern school that is related both to the fact that physical punishment was supposedly physical punishment were not used in modern schools. Of course, we know they were used actually, but also things like, the fact that the day is divided to concrete rubrics of time. I remember one of the writers he wrote, "Suddenly there was time. Like before there was no time, and now we have the class. We know which class we are going to in each and every day, in each and every hour." And also the new school uniform that were often some kind of variation on Western attire, and sitting at desks, next to desks on, sorry, something here, okay, on chairs. This is also a new thing. So this entire experience of modern education changed not just the knowledge of the pupils who experienced it, but also their comportment, their feeling of themselves and of their bodies. Alongside this, we read the depictions of the maktab and how full of the very negative depictions of maktab teachers, of the practices of physical punishment, of how ignorant the teachers actually were, and this thus constructing the education, the traditional education at the maktab, as not giving knowledge, but vice versa, actually producing ignorance and producing, sorry, I forgot the word escaped me. So modern education was a defining factor of a new social group. And this social group is often discussed by historians of Iran. It is sometimes called the modern middle class, the intelligentsia, the enlightened class. And I wish to treat them not as middle class, because what I see during these times is that these people belong to the elite. They were not from the middle ranks of society. They were really part of the elite, and what was their defining experience was their modern education, Western-style education. So this group stands at the core of the book, and this group's model of masculinity was not just a matter of identity. It was a tool in its rise to social, cultural, and political hegemony. They were presenting alternative masculinities as corrupt, as weak, as unpatriotic, and old-fashioned, and only their own masculinity as proper masculinity. The next chapter is about really the connection between patriotism and masculinity, nationalism and masculinity, mostly surrounding the era of the constitutional revolution. The Iranian nationalist discourse really took Javanmardi and made it part of patriotism. In order to be a patriot, being Javanmard meant being patriotic. And this is a new thing. To love your country was a new demand for being a proper man. And this way, elite men appropriated patriotism as another prerequisite of their new masculinity. The discourse of patriotism, of constitutionalism, of nationalism was really replete with gendered terms. When they're speaking about what is needed from activists, from revolutionaries, they're speaking in terms of ghayrat, of hamiyat, of hemat. So terms that are usually really connected to ideas of masculinity are now connected to the demand for political action. And on the other hand, the other side of this equation is the emasculation of those who are not patriotic enough. And you can see really quotes that are talking specifically about emasculation, about have all men disappeared and been replaced by non-men, because the non-men are those who are not taking part of the constitutional revolution. And another way to link patriotism with masculinity is through the image of the nation or of the homeland as a mother. And the fact that the homeland is a mother, homeland is portrayed as an old and weak mother of its wayward children, demands that men defend their mother, defend maternal honor, because this maternal honor is being threatened by invasions, by outside forces that practically, they rape the mother, the motherland. And so this is another, once the idea of namus, of this male honor that is centered on female sexual behavior, is linked to the homeland, then of course, the demand of men is to act up to defend their namus. And if they're not acting to do that, then they're losing their honor and they're not really men. And it's not just the metaphor of the motherland as, an actual mother that is being sexually assaulted. It's also the discourse about Iranian women that are now, all Iranian women are now your sisters. All Iranian women are now part of your family. And if they are being threatened, then your honor is being threatened, and you must do something to protect them. And this new idea, or this new metaphor of the family has other important aspects to it. Beforehand, the nation or the country was imagined as a patriarchal family with the Shah as the father. During the constitutional revolution, and I'm of course not the first to show this, there is a move from presenting the father as Shah, the Shah as father of the nation, to presenting the homeland as the mother. And I think this has something to do with the political aims of the revolution itself and with how Iranian families at the time looked and acted. In a patriarchal family, you can't challenge the authority of the father. The father has authority over his children even until old age, even until the children themselves are adult and have their own families. So if we look at this metaphor as a political metaphor, in a country where the Shah is father, you can't stand up to the father. You're not allowed to revolt against the Shah. So the political goals of constitutionalists really forced them to look for a different metaphor. And with the motherland, this metaphor was really something that they could work with, because they were able to get some of the power into their own hands, to take some of the power from the father Shah. The last thing that I show on this, that I show in this chapter, is the way in which pseudo-patriots suddenly appear in this discourse as the ones that can't be trusted. Okay, the parts of Iranian society that can't really be trusted with the new country that that revolutionaries want to erect. And we have two groups. On the one hand, we have the Qajar aristocracy, and they're being seen as so inherently corrupt, almost in a biological manner. It's in their blood. So even if we change, even if we change society, even if we change the country, even if we have a parliament and a constitution, they will do anything in their power to take power back. So they can't be trusted. And on the other hand, we have Iranians, the simple Iranians, those coming from the lower echelons of society. And they're also not to be trusted, because they're not really patriots. They are only using patriotism as a ladder to climb the social hierarchy. And we see it in writings like Jamalzadeh's and again, in the Iranian newspapers of the time. In 1907, you already see cartoons like this one and other cartoons that ridicule the masses' lack of understanding of what constitution is and what the revolution is about. So they are also not to be given a right to lead the country. And this leaves only the new elite, the new Western educated elite. They present themselves as the only legitimate leaders of Iran after the constitutional revolution. And they do it also with using descriptions that are kind of, that have gendered undertones to them. Related to the issue of of Iranian nationalism are the dilemmas of westernization. And if we look at early ideas about the figure of the westernized man, called the Farangi mob, if we look at texts from the late 19th century, this man is not presented in a negative way. He's presented as a real patriot who's trying to improve the country by bringing new ideas and by changing society. But he is being opposed by the conservative elements of society. And these elements of society, the conservative elements of society, are the ones that are ridiculed. So, but this later changes. So the first time, when we first see the terms Farangi mob, then this is the connotation. You see the people who write the texts, they are aware of the criticism voiced against westernization, but they're trying to deflect it by saying, no, this is real patriotism. We are the true nationalistic Iranians, and those who criticize us are really, reactionaries. They see anyone who eats with a spoon is a Farangi mob. And in the Farangi mob, really, cultural capital coincides with financial capital, because the cultural capital, and we see it more when we speak about the next phase, is the deep familiarity or understanding of Western culture. This is the difference between being a superficial Westernizer and a patriotic Westernizer. You had to really get to know Western culture. And how do you get to know Western culture? Usually through studies abroad. And studies abroad were available to those who had money. So this is where we see like these two forms of capital coincide. And following, when we get to the turn of the 20th century, we see another figure coming up, and this is the Fokoli. So Fokoli is named after this item of dress, the Fokol, which is a detachable collar that was popular in Europe at the time, and also in Iran. And at the turn of the 20th century, reformist writers adopted the negative approach to westernizers, but directed it away from themselves and toward non-elite men, and they were the ones they dubbed Fokoli. Fokoli, pose Ali jib khali. So, okay, so you see, there is a matter here of lack of financial capital. Because of this lack of financial capital, the Fokoli is coming from lower strata of society. He can't get to know the Western culture as deep as the elite, and so he can be ridiculed. So they're actually reclaiming this type of criticism of superficial westernization, and they say, okay, yeah, there is a right way and a wrong way to do westernization. The right way is our way, because we studied abroad. We know we can take and incorporate the sources of Western power into our society by being very deeply rooted both in Iranian culture and in Western culture. But there is a wrong way to do westernization. And the wrong way is the way of the Fokoli. And they were ridiculed as those who merely imitated superficial markers of Western cultures, such as dress or mannerisms, without acquiring the true sources of Western power. And the Fokoli posed multiple threats to the emerging hegemonic masculinity. First of all, there was the nationalist threat. Yeah, so they are demeaning themselves in front of the West by this overall imitation of Western mannerism. So of course it threatens national pride. But there is also a class threat, because if the Western-educated elite, men of the Western-educated elite, wanted to acquire their hegemony, their social and cultural hegemony, they couldn't allow themselves to be mistaken for the Fokoli. And it's a problem, because anyone can find himself a walking stick and put some French words into his speech, and then appear to be part of this elite. So this was another threat that they were so invested in trying to dismantle by categorizing types of Fokoli. I found really a typology of Fokoli types in one of the newspapers. And the third threat is a threat that had gendered or sexual undertones. And the Fokoli was seen at one at the same time as a womanizer who preys upon women in the alleyways and the streets, but also as a homosexual, as someone that is really channeling the figure of the Amrad. Because of his shaved face and because of his mannerisms, he was accused of trying to be object of desire to other men. And these two very different sexual behaviors that the Fokoli was accused of were essentially threatening one of the modernizing projects of Iranian society, and one of which, the first one is the desegregation of women. I mean, letting women into the public sphere, and once we have the Fokoli prowling the street in search of women, so this threatens this project. And the other one is the heteronormalization of Iranian society because of his sexual allure to other men. And the Fokoli was also another thing. The Fokoli was also a very urban phenomenon, something that belonged to the changing face of Iranian cities that were themselves becoming more and more westernized. And if we were talking about sexuality, then the next chapter of my book is about male sexuality and how it had to change. And here we already move into the era of the interwar years, the era of Reza Shah's reign. And during the interwar years, the discourse on sexuality became increasingly oriented towards reproduction. As Iranian reformists held monogamy as the only healthy and moral way to lead family life, male sexuality was increasingly regulated. And this change originated from the nation's perceived need to increase its population and produce morally and physically healthy citizens. And new laws, new marriage laws, were presented as supporting this cause of creating healthier and more numerous offspring for the country. And this urge, this idea of a population crisis in Iran and of a marriage crisis, that people don't marry as early as they should. People delay their marriage to a later and later age. So this idea really was at the center of marriage reform and of creating the monogamous union of men and women that are also approximately the same age, as a national goal. And this new model of marriage was supposed to prevent promiscuous behavior. It was supposed to prevent venereal diseases, and it was supposed to create happier family life for both men and women. And one of the things that also happened alongside this, this discussion of the new ideal form of marriage is a delimitation of male sexuality. Because suddenly there were less and less legitimate objects of male desire to be had. So, for example, child brides were, child marriage were seen as counter-reproductive because girls who married at too early an age would have more problems with pregnancy and with giving birth. Another object of male desire that was becoming less and less legitimate is the adolescent boy, the amrad. And as shown by other scholars, of course, the boy-loving or amrad-loving was very acceptable in Iran during this time. And this is one of the photos that I found in a photo album, just a regular photo album that includes men posing with their boy lovers. So we can see that this was really something that was normative. Having a dancer as your lover, but of course this is not something that is conducive to reproduction. So amrad loving was being marginalized, and another thing about the figure of the amrad is that it is a bit confusing. Because what exactly is their gender? They're not men, but they're not women as well. There's something else. And what I believe also helped this marginalization of the amrad is the fact that during modernization, things change. deep things change and change drastically. And during times of change, people have a tendency to try and hold on to very clear borders. And these borders, we can see them as the borders of the nation, as the borders of the country, but also as the borders of gender. And trying to have like a very clear idea of what is a man and what is a woman. And the Amrad is disrupting this clear dichotomy. So another reason for them to be moved out of the way. And men who clung to old sexual norms, and this also included polygamy, were decried as immoral, as old-fashioned, and unpatriotic, because the patriotic man had to harness his sexuality in order to produce healthy offspring for the country. So while wives' lot in married life could have been somewhat improved by this, because now you had like the single adult Iranian wife, because there was a lot of discussion about Iranian men taking on foreign wives. So she became the sole object, legitimate object of desire, and perhaps also the object of emotional attachment. Men still held financial power and control. And this continued financial power and control was accentuated in texts that discussed men's late bachelorhood, because who was blamed for late bachelorhood? Women were blamed for this because of their spending habits. Women were spending too much, they weren't as frugal as European wives, and therefore men were very hesitant to take on themselves this burden of married life. So here we can see how even when hegemonic masculinity changes in ways that could somehow change or challenge patriarchy, something on the other side balances it right back. Continues the financial control of men over women. So if we are now during Reza Shah's time, so another chapter deals with Reza Shah's male dress reform. And in 1927, there was a dress law passed that required all Iranian men to wear a suit and the Pahlavi hat, rather than their very diverse earlier types of dress that were often visual markers of ethnicity, of religion, of geographic locations, etc., etc. This reform was promoted in the press, mostly semi-official newspapers such as Etelaat, and it was promoted by presenting the new dress as more beautiful, more hygienic, more patriotic than other types of dress, and also, of course, those who were wearing Western suits were therefore more beautiful, more hygienic, and more patriotic. And what I see here is during Reza Shah's time, the Western educated elite, the men who are really like the core of my book, are reaching positions of power in government. And they are implementing the reforms they were advocating for in previous times, but also creating kind of an identity or making their own type of masculinity, their own ideal of masculinity, a state-sanctioned model of masculinity. And you can see it, for example, in this law. Okay, in this law that tries to create or to mold all Iranian men according to this new model. Another thing is that once we have this law, its enforcement really brings forth the new power relations between the Pahlavi state and the citizens. The fact that the state is able to enforce something as intimate and as, as daily as dress really brings home the message that, there's a new boss in town. And the new state, the new government can tell you how you're supposed to dress and can do things that are as humiliating as, tearing the turban off your head and sending you home bareheaded. So on the one hand, we have like this new model of masculinity that is becoming the state model. On the other hand, we have the entrenchment of the new power relations between state and citizens. And another thing is that that is entrenched is the cultural hegemony of the elite. And what I mean by this is the fact that the Western educated elite, men of the Western educated elite, were already wearing these clothes. They knew how to wear them. They knew that they had to be ironed in a certain way, what kind of angle should you put your hat on. But other men were not. And for them, learning the practices of this new dress was sometimes a very embarrassing process. They didn't know, what to do with these new clothes, how to hold themselves in these new clothes. So think of a situation of, a gathering of bureaucrats, of government workers. When you have the ones who are already being used to wearing suits and feel very comfortable, and others that are very self-conscious of this new attire. And one of the things that I like about this photo is the fact that you see how it's not entirely there yet. I mean, he has the suit and everything, and he has the hat, but he's still wearing givet, okay? And if you look closely, he still has henna on his fingernails. And his pants are not exactly, worn to the correct length. So you see that the attempt to create like the unified appearance is not something that could be fully achieved. And I really like this photo. And from dress to the body itself. Because under Reza Shah, the male body itself had to change. There was a new male body image, an athletic body image that came to represent Iran's the new Iran, the modern Iran, the Iran that was muscular, that was tan, that was upright. And this new body was to be achieved by sport, by scouting, and by soldiering. So sport and scouting were really promoted by Reza Shah's regime as tools for creating this new masculine body. But also, alongside the importance of creating a new body was the fact that sport and scouting were creating loyalty to the dynasty, loyalty to the regime. And this was no less important than the new body. And the new body was the the desire to create the new body was also very much linked to military service, because scouting and sporting were considered as preparing the youth to military service. And on the other hand, military service itself was presented in the newspapers as a form of, a bodybuilding project. Why should you become a soldier? Because they were so handsome in their uniform. They were so upright. And the interesting thing is that despite the regime's militarism and the universal conscription law and massive spending on the army, soldiers actually did not become new emblems of hegemonic masculinity. And in this chapter, what I see is that this was the result of the fact that even after the conscription law, it was mostly men from the poorest echelons of society that became the rank and file soldiers. Elite men usually found their way out of the army in some manner or another. They didn't want to become soldiers. They saw military service as a waste of time. So soldiers were not like models of hegemonic masculinity. And once again, if we look at this photo, which is also another of my favorite photos in the book, we see, of course, this man with the military attire, and we see the photo of Reza Shah. But then there's something weird here, right? Because we see these gives, right? And something here, someone is holding the photo, and he stood here. So they photoshopped him outside of the photo. So, and I see this photo is really emblematic of the way in which Reza Shah's regime was trying to erase former masculinities and the ways in which this erasure could not have been complete. And in the conclusions to the chapter, what I see is that many of the traits, many of the characteristics of hegemonic masculinities that were created during the late 19th century remained influential in Iran to much later period. Whether in appearance or patriotism, heterosexuality, or modern education, many of the components of this model of masculinity were still in evidence during Mohammad Reza Shah's reign and even survived the Islamic Revolution. So this is something that it shows how powerful these ideas were. And I finish here and open the floor to your questions. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I was wondering regarding the changes in the sexual and gender ideology that the state was trying to propagate. How does a state implement such changes in this sexual ideology of the masses? How was this idea and notion of delimiting men's sexualities propagated? And was this commonly circumvented by those in upper classes? It seems like such a personal and deeply entrenched practice to suddenly be cut off by the state. So how was it implemented, and was it circumvented by certain groups?
Okay, so I don't think it was really like the state here, or there were new ruling ideas about sexuality, and you see them promoted in the press, for example, in discussions of marriage laws. So in one way that the state could implement these things is by changing marriage laws. But I see that under Reza Shah, the changes were quite minor. They were very hesitant to actually limit men's sexual choice. They weren't really limiting polygamy. They were trying to limit the age of marriage, and this is something that a state can do, what it allows to register. But people could circumvent that, of course. They would, and they would. But you see the intellectual discourse, and you see the newspapers and how they ridicule, how they present men who still practice polygamy or child marriage, how they are really being portrayed as vile, as corrupt in various genres of literature. So this is something that, on the one hand, yes, the state can try and enforce things from one angle, but there's really a new intellectual vibe to it.
Thank you very much. This was fascinating, and I really like how this talk is very grounded in Iranian culture on the one hand, but also de-exceptionalizes Iran by showing the debates that happen in Russia and in China and in Japan are also happening in Iran. So following that, my question is when we talk about westernization and education, what specifically are they reading? There's so much to choose from, Rousseau, Tolstoy, all the way to eugenics. So are they reading specific literature? Does it change over time? And my second question is more why did you choose this topic? Usually people who study gender focus on women, and you decided to focus on men.
They were reading quite a lot, I think. One of the things that I do know is Emile, for example, that was very, very influential all over. Yeah. So this is one text that was influential, but I didn't really go into the text that they were reading. And as for your other question, I never thought I would work on gender originally, because I felt that what is there to write about? Women were studied so much in Iran. There's really a lot of research about women, but it was a course that I took during my bachelor's degree about men's status in a feminist society or something like that, and suddenly I thought, okay, but what about men? We read a lot about women, but men have gender as well. And this is something that I find that, okay, somebody must have written about it. And I started looking, and okay, not that many people wrote about masculinity, so of course I was very happy to find something that is so big. As Professor Milani told you, it was a big project, and almost wide open. And also, one of the interesting things is that once I started looking for masculinity, it was everywhere. So many texts that were about education, texts that were about nationalism, texts that were about women, were actually about men. And if you could read between the lines, you understood how masculine they were. So so this is what happened. I didn't think I would work on gender, and suddenly I was.
What was the percentage of this elite society that are involved that it would change?
Oh, tiny. Very, very small minority. Very, very small minority, but powerful because of, first of all, when we get to Reza Shah's period, they were powerful politically as well. But they were powerful because they were the ones producing a lot of the cultural products of the time. They were writing in the newspapers, they were writing the books, they were often the ones taking the photographs. So, of course, there is the bias of my sources. This is what I have, and these are the people who wrote them. But because I'm working on hegemony, because I'm working on the powerful, then I think that even the fact that, despite the fact that it was a very small group, the power that it had was significant. And we can see, in a way, the influence they had by the fact that people from lower strata of society were trying to look like them, trying to act like them, to emulate them. So I think this is, we can see that their influence was much greater than their numbers.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is very, very interesting for me to listen to. I was wondering how a rural peasant, sharecropping, villagers would fit into these ideas, these changing ideas. And also, I'm wondering what kind of changes that you're talking about would be apparent in rural village areas, or was this mainly an urban thing? And also, are there sources? Maybe the sources don't really talk about what's going on in villages or rural areas. As an ethnographer who's worked in former, anyway, village areas, I'm wondering about this.
Yeah, so I do think this is mostly an urban phenomenon. And that during these times, especially, the longer back that we go, the further back that we go, then the villages or rural society or tribal society were less and less affected by these changes that happened in the urban centers. Even though, I have like glimpses in my sources, but not something very rich about rural society. For example, in the article that I saw about the typology of the Fokoli. So there is like the Fokoli who came from the village to the city, okay? Or an anecdote about the village that had only one Pahlavi hat, and they took turns. Anyone who had to go to the city, they took turns in wearing the hat. So these are kind of the things that I can try and pinpoint, but really the sources that I had access to were urban.
You kind of, I guess, answered this a little bit, but I'm wondering if there's like any sources that you came across that kind of rejected this like transformation, and because I know you said there are obviously like bias and like people, these sources are coming from people that were kind of pushing this hegemony. But did you come across anything that like pointed to kind of like discontent with this like new kind of masculinity that seemed to be like adopted?
I see it mostly, first of all, I see it when they are incorporating the criticism voiced against westernization, for example. So obviously there is a criticism. Okay? But also I see it during, as far as we speak about the dress reform, for example. And you see like different types of resistance to the dress reform. And they had all kinds of ways to resist. One way, of course, was, to go and demonstrate, not recommended during these times. But some people would, for example, wear the suit and hat while they were outside, and then they would go inside and would change into their traditional garb. or would take off their jackets, take off their hats once they were inside the office, or would try and negotiate with the government for a position to have like an exemption on the basis of their religious status, because the government was allowing clergymen with specific authorization from the government to continue wearing their traditional garb. So people were kind of writing to the government and saying, well, you know, this is my status, and could you please confirm that, could you please exempt me? Or people who escaped the country. You know, I saw reports from Mohammare about ulama that crossed the border because they didn't want to, they didn't want to change their dress. So of course there was discontent about many of these things. Or, for example, another something that I read regarding sport. There is a book, like a fictionalized memoir, Rajavi. And he writes that his father, who was more strict, who was older at the times of when he was a child, he said that he was against all organized sports because it was just a scheme of the government to get the young people to the army. So you see that there was definitely, it didn't proceed smoothly at all times.
So you touched on the kind of the marriage and population crisis. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate more on what motivated that, and how was it enforced? I'm curious because it changes a lot of things that have been ingrained in Iranian society, and I'm wondering what really motivated this profound change.
I think, first of all, there was a discourse like this. Demography and population crisis was a global discourse. It wasn't just an Iranian thing. And you have to also remember what happened in Iran during the First World War. Because it was a horrible time in Iran, with probably millions dying of hunger and disease. So the body, the population itself was decreasing. And so there was this anxiety about, okay, there aren't enough people in the country. And also the idea that the strength of a nation is linked to the number of the people. And this was kind of this motivation of, look, why is the population spread so thin in Iran? We have to think about increasing the population. But it was related and it wasn't related, because you would think that if you want to increase the population, then polygamy is like an obvious answer. But there was also like a cultural debate on women's status and on how we are going to become a modern society. And polygamy was not something that could be easily incorporated into this idea of the new Iran. So they said, okay, why is polygamy wrong? Because it leads to the women actually cheating on their husbands because they are jealous of the other women, and it leads to financial ruin because the man can't really support all his wives. So they had other arguments against. But yeah, so this is the kind of way that they were referring. And when they were discussing, for example, venereal diseases, you see that what they were concerned about was the way it affected future generations. The birth of children with various disabilities or miscarriages and things like that. So this is how things were framed.
Your discussion of hegemonic, all-powerful man reminds me very much of Nazis' ideal type of malehood. I was wondering if there was any impact or influence.
It was probably there as well. I mean, the idea of the importance or the centrality of the male physique that was common, not just in Nazi Germany. It was all over Europe. So this was probably something that was influencing people in Iran as well. And you see also how they are. You see in the photographs, it was not just the male body, but also the groups. The groups of very disciplined young people marching or practicing sports as a way to show the power of the nation. It was something that, it was a global idea.
And of course, there is a Shah's close ties to Germany and to...
Yes, it was another, you see in Iranian Bastan, in the newspaper, you see like the photographs from Nazi Germany and Iran, and they're really like similar. Yes.
So, Professor Milani told you this was a big project. I think it's even bigger than what you presented. I'm just listening to you. I'm thinking whether there's a parallel process in Turkey going on with Kemalism at the same time with the creation of a new westernizing elite, a desire to disengage from a past that seems to be a failure, a renegotiation of gender relations, the clothing. I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of Orhan Pamuk novel in the context of Turkey, but also with Zionism. And in a way, Zionism is almost the opposite process. You have these, Jews in Eastern and Central and Northern Europe who are moving, who are changing their own dress, who are seeking to reinvent themselves through physical labor, who are renegotiating gender relations in the context of a different space. So I think you're onto something, much bigger about political order and the formation of new elites under conditions of social and technological turmoil. So I would just encourage you to pursue this further, because I just think it's absolutely fascinating.
Oh, thank you very much. I think, people have done some of these things. I mean, George Mosse wrote already in 1982, I think, in his book about nationalism and sexuality, about the links between the creation of new respectability, new sexuality, and the nation state, and there is a lot of things that are in common to many nationalist movements, including Zionism, including things in Turkey, including Egypt. You see it, and the links are really interesting.
Even the idea of the land as being the mother Moledit, right? The Moledit, the birthland.
Yeah.
And the kind of redemption of the land through physical labor, etc.
Yeah. So I think about Zionism, there are a few people who wrote interesting scholarship about this, and yeah, it's similar. It's not, Iran is not unique in these things. How you imagine the country, how you imagine the nation. The fact that the nation is a family. Of course, it's common to many other nations.
Obviously, I think this is a brilliant book, but there's an elephant in the room that you haven't touched, and that's the dominant model of masculinity forced by Islam and Iranian society. And during this period, there is no other paradigm that fights as forcefully, as brutally, as systematically this model. And we can't talk about it because, first of all, we've done a brilliant job trying to unpack this model, But the dominant model of masculinity isn't these intellectuals, it's the clergy, who are fighting every aspect that you mentioned. Their biggest enemy is the clergy. Going to girls' school, conscription. They fought conscription because they thought it would get people out of their hands. So I don't know how one can discuss this model as brilliantly as you have, and not how can you then incorporate that, and how their biggest enemy, and continuing today, the dominant large woman liberty is fighting that same model that fought Reza Shah and fought the constitutional revolution.
Yeah, I think naturally, there are the limits to what one can do in the scope of one book or one dissertation. This was my dissertation, but I think this is something that definitely needs to be done. And you need to go into religious texts, into fatwas, into into sermons, whichever you can, whichever one can get their hands on, to look at, and I'm certain that you would find changes within religious masculinity as well. And also I would surmise that there isn't one religious masculinity, that there were some models of religious masculinity, but yes, they are absent. It's like my players are fighting an invisible enemy here. But yeah, I was interested in the rise to power of a new social group, and the social groups that are being weakened by this new group are the religious establishment, or religion-based ideas of masculinity. Even though, for example, something to be considered is how do you figure Javanmardi into this, which is also a very powerful model.
For them, Ali is a
yeah, and you have also Puriayev Ali, and so some images of muscular Islam perhaps rose throughout these ages, but this is for someone else perhaps to take the job.
With the Qajars and centuries of Iranian rulers before them having been Turkic, and Reza Shah introducing a new understanding of Iranian nationality and its implementation, was there any transforming ethnic aspect to this patriotic masculinity? Of course, this extends to the plethora of ethnic minorities in Iran. It's just that this is exactly the period when understandings of ethnic nationality were becoming more relevant, which is.
It was, but not in name. I mean, the desire was to create a unified, a unified nation, and in this unified nation, there was no room for the ethnic minorities, basically. And you see it when you see it with discussions of the dress reform, for example, because they say, what kind of dress should we choose for ourselves? Would it be the Kurdish? Would it be the Baluch? Would it be da-da-da? No. Yeah. So we need some kind of a dress that would unify everything, and by unifying, the meaning is erasing these primordial forms of attachments or sentiments, and creating the imagined community of the nation, in which everyone will be part of the nation. But we know that, of course, that the Persian ethnicity had a more elevated status under Reza Shah. So yes, so we see it in these kinds of things. That it is obvious that the people who were promoting these new ideas, they saw ethnicity as a problem. You know, the ethnic minorities as hindering the new nationalism.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, thank you. That was an amazing talk. And I'd like to return to Professor Milani's question, which is that of thinking about the role of clergy and how the clergy is responding, religion is responding to these emergent notions of masculinity. And I think one response, as you were responding to Professor Milani's question, one response is to look at what is clergy, how is clergy responding to masculinity, to westernized masculinity. The other model could also be to look at how the so-called secular masculinity is responding to clerical masculinity, and incorporating certain notions of ostentation, frugality. You mentioned frugality in your presentation, and also thinking about reformulation of masculinity through these religious notions of frugality, of ostentation, of sexual control, and what have you. So I wonder if you encountered this in your project so far or in future, there's a way for you to think about secular masculinity as a way of also reformulating itself to the challenges of clerical masculinity.
Well, from what I see, there isn't really kind of either an attack or a direct response to clerical masculinity, but there is the despised figure of the Ahund. Okay, so the lower level cleric, and to these they do react, and you see it in their when they speak about or write about the maktab, and how and about the ignorance of these people, and really they describe their knowledge as harmful knowledge, as knowledge that is to a degree even feminized knowledge. It's like grandmother's tales. It's on the same category as old women's tales, the knowledge that the maktab provides students. Plus, there is a problem with the texts, because some of the like poetry that has homoerotic tones, so they're criticizing the curriculum of the maktab as something that is corrupting the youth, and in other places it's where they ridicule practices of marriage, like these conservative man who is really very, very corrupt, and he's getting married to many women, but he also has sikhe, and he also, in the rooms of the madrasa, they are actually, having sexual intercourse with young men or with prostitutes. So this is the kind of attack that I do see, but I haven't really seen any attempt to deal with, more abstract notions, perhaps, of religious masculinity.
Before we adjourn, just thank you so much for your talk. I hope you can address a topic that's really dear to, I think, millions of Iranians, especially to my heart, and that's the creation and the birth of the music, the traditional music of Iran. A lot of the artifacts show that during the Qajar dynasty, the first notes ever written for the two main instruments, the santur and the tar, came during the Qajar dynasty, and all of a sudden it's as if everything vanished, and all music was a taboo topic back then, and that's a different topic of why it was not practiced and taught in the Western culture. In your studies and your wealth of research about what you talked about today. How does music and the birth of Iranian music fit into all of that, and the evolution of what you talked about, how westernized we became? We have probably hundreds of words that are French-based in the Persian language. How did music evolve into all of that, especially from where it was conceived to where it is?
Well, all I can do about this question is apologize that I really don't know anything about this topic. I haven't seen direct writings about music, so this is for someone else perhaps to answer. Sorry.
For researchers,
Yeah.
including the Qajar dynasty,
Yeah.
the notes ever written were during that time,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was almost like confiscated, and it was taboo for years and years to come.
We have had a couple of talks by experts on this. You go on our website, the history of notation in Iranian music.
Oh.
Anecdotally, it is not discussed, but historically, so there's a lot more. First notes were not in Qajar, actually, were much, much older, at least more than the years before that. But thank you very much for